Tonight, we are traveling back nearly 100 years to a quieter America, a land of endless open skies, small wooden farmhouses, gentle winds, and a silence that would soon be swallowed by something no family had ever imagined. Before you settle in, find a comfortable place to rest. Let your breathing become slow and steady. Allow your thoughts to drift away with the evening breeze as we step into the Great Plains of the United States during the early 1930s. Our story is not one of kings or famous generals. It is about ordinary families, mothers preparing supper, fathers repairing fences, children chasing grasshoppers beneath an enormous blue sky. Life moved slowly here. The towns were small. Most roads were nothing more than packed dirt. Horses still worked beside tractors, and every sunrise carried the promise of another day's work on the farm. The people believed they understood the land. For decades, wheat fields stretched farther than the eye could see. Golden waves rolled gently beneath the warm summer sun, creating a peaceful rhythm that shaped every season of life. Many believed the Great Plains would feed America forever. No one realized the land itself was becoming tired. Years earlier, millions of acres of native prairie grass had been removed to make room for farming. Those deep roots had quietly protected the soil for thousands of years, holding the earth together even during strong winds. Without them, the ground became lighter, doctorier, more fragile. But few people noticed. Harvest after harvest seemed successful enough to convince everyone that everything was perfectly fine. Then the rain began to disappear. One season passed, then another. The ponds slowly shrank. Streams became narrow ribbons of muddy water. The air felt different, warmer, still. Farmers looked toward the horizon every evening, hoping to see dark clouds carrying much-needed rain. Instead, the sky remained empty. Across Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico, tiny cracks appeared in the fields. At first they seemed harmless. Just another dry year. Nothing unusual. People had survived difficult seasons before. Surely the rain would return. Neighbors gathered outside general stores discussing the weather in calm voices. Maybe next week. Perhaps next month. Everyone believed patience would solve the problem. Meanwhile, the wind quietly waited. No one could hear it preparing. No one imagined that these peaceful farms would soon become the center of one of the greatest environmental disasters in American history. Evenings remained strangely beautiful. Orange sunsets painted the western sky. Children still laughed. Dogs rested beneath wooden porches. Lanterns glowed softly inside family homes, while supper cooked on old iron stoves. Everything looked normal. Yet beneath every footstep, the earth had already begun changing. Every dry day loosened another thin layer of soil. Every passing breeze carried away tiny grains too small for anyone to notice. Slowly, patiently, the land itself was beginning to leave. If someone had stood alone outside on one of those quiet evenings, they might have heard only the sound of distant cattle, the gentle creaking of windmills, and the soft whisper of dry grass moving across the prairie. Nothing frightening. Nothing dramatic, only silence. The kind of silence that often arrives just before history changes forever. Tonight's journey has only begun. The first great dust storm has not yet appeared. But somewhere beyond the western horizon, the wind is gathering, and with it comes a story that millions of Americans would never forget. So close your eyes. Listen to the quiet prairie, because tomorrow, the sky itself will begin to disappear.
Morning arrived gently across the great plains. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the endless fields, touching weathered fences, quiet barns, and rows of wheat that no longer swayed as they once had. The air felt unusually still. For many families, it was simply another day. A kettle warmed on the stove, fresh bread baked slowly in cast-iron ovens. Children pulled on worn leather boots before helping their parents with the morning chores. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet beyond the horizon, something invisible had already begun. The wind, not a fierce wind, not yet, only a steady current of dry air moving across thousands of miles of open land. It passed over fields stripped of their protective prairie grasses. It lifted tiny grains of loose soil. At first, no one noticed. The dust was almost weightless. A faint brown haze drifted across distant fields before disappearing into the bright blue sky. Farmers had seen dust before. It was part of life. No one stopped working. Plows continued cutting through the dry earth. Tractors rolled across fields that had grown harder with every passing week. Children laughed as they chased one another near wooden fences. The quiet routine of farm life continued, but each afternoon the haze returned, a little thicker, a little darker. Some evenings the setting sun appeared slightly redder than usual. Its golden light softened into deep shades of orange and crimson as fine dust floated through the atmosphere. It was beautiful in an unsettling way. People admired the colorful sunsets without realizing what created them. Neighbors exchanged quiet conversations. "The wind's been stronger lately. Maybe we'll finally get rain. I've never seen the sky look quite like that." Still, there was little fear. The greatest danger remained unseen beneath their feet. The soil itself had become dry enough to lift into the air with even the gentlest breeze. Weeks passed, then months. The rain never came. Instead, the land grew lighter, more fragile. Each passing day carried away another thin layer of earth that had taken centuries to form. Without realizing it, farmers were watching their future disappear grain by grain. Inside the homes, daily life continued with quiet determination. Mothers swept dust from wooden floors every evening. Windows were wiped clean again and again. Curtains collected a thin layer of brown powder. Tiny piles of dirt appeared in the corners of rooms, even when every door remained closed. No one could understand how the dust kept finding its way inside. Children began drawing pictures in the dust that settled across tables. It almost became a game. But the adults worried in silence. At night, the wind whispered against the walls of the farmhouse. A soft, dry sound, almost like gentle rain. Except there was no rain, only dust. The livestock noticed the change before many people did. Cattle searched longer for fresh grass. Horses lowered their heads against the growing wind. Chickens stayed unusually quiet. Even the birds seemed to disappear from the skies. Nature often senses change before people do. And nature was preparing. By early 1934, enormous clouds of dust were beginning to rise more frequently across parts of Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico. Some storms stretched for miles. Others disappeared as quickly as they arrived. Most people believed they would pass. Just another strange season. Nothing more. They could not imagine what was coming next. The storms would grow taller than mountains. They would block out the sun in the middle of the afternoon. Families would lose their farms, their homes, their health. Some would leave forever. Others would stay, hoping tomorrow would be kinder than today. Morning arrived gently across the great plains. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the endless fields, touching weathered fences, quiet barns, and rows of wheat that no longer swayed as they once had. The air felt unusually still. For many families, it was simply another day. A kettle warmed on the stove, fresh bread baked slowly in cast-iron ovens. Children pulled on worn leather boots before helping their parents with the morning chores. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet beyond the horizon, something invisible had already begun. The wind, not a fierce wind, not yet, only a steady current of dry air moving across thousands of miles of open land. It passed over fields stripped of their protective prairie grasses. It lifted tiny grains of loose soil. At first, no one noticed. The dust was almost weightless. A faint brown haze drifted across distant fields before disappearing into the bright blue sky. Farmers had seen dust before. It was part of life. No one stopped working. Plows continued cutting through the dry earth. Tractors rolled across fields that had grown harder with every passing week. Children laughed as they chased one another near wooden fences. The quiet routine of farm life continued, but each afternoon the haze returned, a little thicker, a little darker. Some evenings the setting sun appeared slightly redder than usual. Its golden light softened into deep shades of orange and crimson as fine dust floated through the atmosphere. It was beautiful in an unsettling way. People admired the colorful. The seasons continued their quiet march across the Great Plains. Winter faded gently into spring, yet the familiar signs of renewal never truly arrived. The fields remained pale and dry, their surface breaking apart into countless tiny fragments that crumbled beneath every careful step. Morning after morning, farmers walked outside with the same silent hope. Perhaps today would bring rain. They searched the horizon for dark clouds, studying every change in the sky, as though nature might finally offer a different answer. But the answer was always the same. A clear blue sky, a dry wind, and another day without rain. Across the small farming towns, life continued with remarkable determination. Children still attended one-room schoolhouses. Teachers carefully brushed dust from wooden desks before each lesson. Store owners swept their front porches several times each day, though the fine brown powder always seemed to return within hours. The dust had become an unwanted neighbor. It settled on books, on dinner tables, on freshly washed clothes hanging outside to dry. Even inside tightly closed cupboards, tiny grains somehow appeared. People spoke about it quietly. No one complained for very long. There was simply too much work to do. Every family believed that if they could endure just a little longer, the weather would surely change. One afternoon, a farmer in western Oklahoma noticed something unusual. Far beyond the horizon, the sky no longer met the earth in a sharp, clear line. Instead, a faint brown shadow stretched across the distance. At first, it resembled ordinary rain clouds, slow-moving, low against the land. But these were not clouds. As the hours passed, the shadow grew taller, wider, darker. It seemed to rise directly from the ground itself. Neighbors stepped onto their porches. Some shaded their eyes against the afternoon sun. Others simply stood in silence. No one could fully understand what they were seeing. The wind arrived first. Not violent, just steady, warm, dry. It carried the familiar scent of sun-baked earth. Then came the dust. Fine particles drifted gently through the air like smoke. Within minutes, the sunlight softened into a strange amber glow. Shadows disappeared. Colors faded. The bright blue sky slowly turned bronze. Birds that had been circling overhead vanished into the growing haze. Livestock became restless. Cattle gathered close together. Horses turned away from the wind, lowering their heads as if following an instinct older than memory. Inside the farmhouse, a mother quietly called her children indoors. She closed every window. She placed damp cloths beneath the doors, hoping to keep the dust outside. It was a trick many families had begun using. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it did not. The wind continued to strengthen. Outside, fence posts slowly disappeared behind a curtain of drifting soil. The barn across the yard became difficult to see. Voices carried strangely through the thickening air. By late afternoon, lamps were being lit inside homes, not because evening had arrived, but because daylight itself was fading. Children looked through dusty windows with wide, curious eyes. Some thought it looked beautiful. Others felt afraid without knowing why. Parents remained calm. They spoke gently. "It will pass. It always passes." Yet deep inside, many were beginning to wonder if that was still true. The storm lingered for hours before slowly moving eastward. When the sky finally cleared, everything had changed. A fresh layer of fine dust covered the fields. Roads, roofs, trees. Even the smallest blades of grass had disappeared beneath the brown earth. It was not the largest storm, not even close. But it was enough to make people realize that something entirely new had begun. Nature was no longer behaving as it always had. The land itself had become restless, and somewhere beyond the western horizon, even larger storms were already forming. Storms so immense that they would soon earn a name remembered across American history. Black blizzards, but that chapter would begin with another quiet morning. April arrived with a quiet kind of beauty. The mornings were cool. The prairie grasses that had survived the long drought swayed gently in the breeze, and for a few brief days it almost felt as though nature might finally be finding its balance again. Families continued their daily routines. Children laughed on their way to church. Farmers repaired broken fences. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through small wooden kitchens. It was Sunday, April 14th, 1935. No one knew that this peaceful morning would become one of the most remembered days in American environmental history. Across western Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, Texas, and New Mexico, the sky was clear. The sunlight was bright. The wind felt ordinary. Many families spent the morning outdoors. Some attended church services. Others shared quiet meals with relatives after weeks of difficult work. There was a feeling, small but comforting, that perhaps the worst had already passed. Then sometime during the afternoon, people began noticing something unusual. Far to the north, a dark line appeared along the horizon. It looked almost like a distant mountain range. But there were no mountains here, only endless plains. The line grew taller, slowly at first, then with astonishing speed. Within minutes, the dark shape stretched from one side of the horizon to the other. It rose thousands of feet into the sky. The sunlight began to fade. Birdsong stopped. The warm spring afternoon became strangely quiet. Farm animals sensed danger before people did. Horses pulled against their ropes. Cattle gathered together. Dogs barked nervously before running toward barns and porches. The wind strengthened. Dust lifted from the dry fields in countless swirling columns. They joined together, growing darker, thicker, until they formed a single, enormous wall. Witnesses later described it as a giant black cloud rolling across the land. Some said it looked like the end of the world. Others simply stood frozen, unable to understand what they were seeing. Parents called their children inside. Windows were closed. Wet towels were pushed beneath doors. Blankets were hung across cracks in the walls. Families had practiced these routines before, but nothing had prepared them for this. The storm reached the first farms with incredible force. The daylight vanished, not slowly, almost instantly. At only a few minutes past 3 in the afternoon, it became as dark as midnight. Inside the homes, lanterns were lit. Even those small flames struggled against the endless dust drifting through every tiny opening. People covered their noses and mouths with damp cloth. Breathing became difficult. The air itself felt heavy. Outside, nothing could be seen. Not the barn, not the fence, not even a person standing only a few feet away. The wind roared across the plains with a sound many survivors never forgot. It was not like thunder, nor like rain. It sounded more like the deep, endless roar of the ocean. For nearly an hour, the great dust cloud swept across the countryside. Millions of tons of precious topsoil were carried into the sky. Fields disappeared beneath drifting sand-like earth. Roads vanished. Telephone poles became invisible. Entire farms seemed to fade into darkness. And yet, inside many homes, families waited quietly. Parents spoke softly to frightened children. Some prayed, others simply listened. There was nothing else they could do. Eventually, the wind began to weaken. The darkness slowly lifted. A faint gray light returned. Then, little by little, the sun appeared once more. When people stepped outside, they found a world transformed. Every surface was covered in dust. Fence lines had disappeared beneath drifts. Farm equipment lay half buried. Trees looked gray instead of green. The familiar landscape no longer seemed familiar at all. That single storm became known as Black Sunday. It did not end the Dust Bowl. In many ways, it marked its most unforgettable chapter. For thousands of families, life would never return to what it had been before that quiet Sunday afternoon. But even in the days that followed, hope had not completely disappeared. Somewhere beneath the endless layers of dust, seeds still waited, and so did the people. When the great storm finally passed, the silence felt different. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of the open prairie. Instead, it was the silence of people trying to understand what had just happened. As the first rays of morning sunlight reached the farms, they revealed a landscape that seemed almost unfamiliar. Wooden fences had disappeared beneath gentle drifts of dust. Garden paths could no longer be seen. Even the wheels of old wagons were half buried beneath layers of loose earth. The fields, once golden with wheat, now looked like an endless brown desert. For many families, the first task of every morning became cleaning. Doors were opened carefully. Dust was swept from porches. Blankets were shaken outside. Windows were washed again and again. By evening, a new layer had already settled. It seemed impossible to keep anything truly clean. Inside the farmhouse, every meal carried a faint taste of soil. Fine grains of dust found their way into flour, drinking water, and freshly cooked bread. Children sometimes laughed about it. They would joke that even the butter had become dusty. Their parents smiled gently, but behind those smiles was quiet worry. Every breath carried tiny particles into their lungs. Doctors across the Great Plains began seeing more patients with deep coughs and difficulty breathing. Some children woke during the night struggling for air. Older farmers who had spent years working outside found each breath becoming slower and more painful. The illness would later become known as dust pneumonia. It was not caused by germs alone. It came from breathing enormous amounts of fine soil suspended in the air day after day. Many recovered, some did not. To protect themselves, families became remarkably resourceful. Wet sheets were hung across windows. Damp towels blocked the cracks beneath doors. Some people wore homemade cloth masks whenever they stepped outside. Others poured water onto the ground around their homes, hoping to keep the dust from rising quite so easily. Every small idea offered a little comfort. Every small success brought hope. Life adjusted to the new reality. Schools sometimes closed when the storms became too severe. Teachers waited patiently for clearer skies before lessons resumed. Mail carriers continued their routes whenever possible, navigating roads that often disappeared beneath fresh layers of drifting earth. Store owners kept their doors closed against the wind. Churches remained places of quiet comfort where neighbors gathered not only to pray, but simply to sit together and remind one another that they were not alone. In difficult times, community became one of the strongest forms of survival. Neighbors shared food. They helped repair damaged roofs. They searched together for lost livestock after each storm. No family could face the Dust Bowl entirely by themselves. Children, despite everything, still found moments of happiness. They played card games by lantern light. They listened as grandparents told stories from years before the drought. They imagined what the prairie must have looked like when the grass had stretched endlessly across the land. Sometimes, hope arrived through memory. Other times, it arrived through simple kindness. Yet the storms continued, week after week, month after month. Each new cloud carried away another small piece of the land. Some families began asking difficult questions. How much longer could they stay? Would the rain ever return? Could these farms still provide a future for their children? There were no easy answers, only quiet evenings, soft conversations, and long nights filled with the gentle sound of dust brushing against the walls of wooden homes. Far beyond the Great Plains, the rest of America was beginning to notice. Newspapers carried photographs unlike anything people had ever seen. Great black clouds, buried farms, families standing against impossible winds. Soon, the entire nation would learn the name, the Dust Bowl, and help, though slow to arrive, was finally beginning its journey. As the months slowly turned into years, many families realized that hope alone could no longer feed a household. The fields that had once provided wheat, corn, and enough income to last through the winter had become quiet stretches of drifting earth. Each harvest grew smaller than the one before it. For some families, there was simply nothing left to harvest at all. The decision to leave was never easy. A farmhouse was more than a building. It held birthdays, family dinners, wedding photographs, and the memories of generations who had worked the same land with patient hands. Leaving meant saying goodbye to a lifetime. Many families waited as long as they possibly could. They repaired broken roofs. They borrowed money from neighbors. They prayed for rain. But eventually, the silence of empty fields became impossible to ignore. One by one, old trucks were loaded, a few blankets, simple cooking pots, family Bibles, favorite toys, boxes filled with photographs and letters. Everything else had to remain behind. There simply wasn't enough room. Early each morning, long lines of vehicles rolled slowly onto dusty roads. Some traveled in aging automobiles that had already seen many years of use. Others drove small pickup trucks piled high with furniture, mattresses, and wooden chairs tied carefully with rope. Children often sat quietly among the family's belongings, watching familiar landscapes disappear behind them. Few knew exactly where they were going. Most only knew they had to keep moving. Many had heard stories about California. They imagined green orchards, fresh water, jobs waiting in the fields, a place where rain still fell from the sky. It became a destination filled with hope. The journey west followed highways that stretched for hundreds of miles across deserts, mountains, and wide-open plains. One road became especially well known, U.S. Route 66. Families traveled its long ribbon of pavement toward an uncertain future. The trip was rarely comfortable. Cars often broke down, money was limited, gasoline had to be used carefully. Many nights were spent sleeping beneath the stars beside the road. Parents prepared simple meals over small campfires. Children listened to crickets while the warm evening breeze moved gently through the dry grass. Even during difficult times, there were moments of peace. Strangers shared drinking water. Mechanics sometimes repaired broken engines for little or no payment. Farmers offered fresh vegetables when they had extra to spare. Small acts of kindness became unforgettable. Yet not every welcome was warm. As thousands of families arrived in western states searching for work, jobs became increasingly difficult to find. Temporary camps appeared near farms and orchards. Canvas tents stretched across open fields. Old cars became family homes. People waited patiently each morning, hoping someone would offer a day's work picking fruit or harvesting crops. Some found employment. Many did not. Life remained uncertain. Still, most parents continued smiling whenever their children were watching. Hope, they believed, was just as important as food. Back on the Great Plains, those who remained continued their quiet struggle against the wind. Some farms stood completely empty. Doors swung gently in the breeze. Windmills turned above abandoned houses where no evening lanterns glowed anymore. Entire communities grew smaller. Schools closed as families moved away. Church pews slowly became emptier with each passing season. The Dust Bowl was changing more than the land. It was reshaping lives, families, and the map of America itself. But far away in Washington, D.C., leaders, scientists, and farmers were beginning to search for lasting solutions. They believed the land could heal, not quickly, not easily, but with patience, knowledge, and care. The story of survival was far from over. In many ways, its most hopeful chapter had yet to begin, after years of watching the wind carry away the earth. A quiet question began to spread across the Great Plains. What if the land could be healed? It was a simple thought, yet for many families it felt almost impossible to believe. The prairie had changed so much that some children could hardly remember what the fields had looked like before the drought. The endless waves of golden wheat had been replaced by drifting brown dust. The familiar songs of meadow birds had become much quieter. Even the wind sounded different now. But while farmers continued their daily struggle, people across the country were searching for answers. Scientists traveled from town to town, They walked through damaged fields. They knelt beside the dry soil, letting the loose earth slip gently through their fingers. They listened carefully to the stories of local farmers. Many realized that the drought alone had not caused the disaster. For generations, the Great Plains had been protected by native prairie grasses. Their deep roots reached far beneath the surface, holding the soil together through dry seasons and powerful winds. When much of that natural grassland had been plowed under to grow wheat, the land became far more vulnerable. The earth had lost its quiet protector. Understanding the problem was only the beginning. Finding a solution would take patience. Across the region, farmers slowly began learning new ways to care for the soil, instead of plowing every field in the same direction. Many started following the natural curves of the land. This helped slow the wind and reduce the amount of soil that could be carried away. Others planted strips of grass between fields. These living barriers helped hold the earth in place. Some fields were left unplanted for a season, allowing the soil to rest and recover. The changes were small, almost invisible at first, but nature often works quietly. Just as the damage had taken years to appear, healing would also require time. One of the most remarkable efforts focused on trees. Across the Great Plains, thousands of volunteers planted long rows of young trees. These shelter belts stretched for miles across open farmland. As the trees grew taller, they slowed the wind before it reached the fields. Their roots strengthened the soil. Their branches provided shelter for birds and wildlife. Years later, many of those trees would still stand as quiet reminders of hope. Farmers shared ideas with one another. Neighbors visited neighboring farms, exchanging advice instead of worrying alone. Communities that had survived together now began rebuilding together. Children noticed the changes too. On some spring mornings, they discovered tiny patches of green where only dust had existed before. Small wildflowers appeared beside country roads. A few birds returned to nest in the sheltering trees. The signs were modest, easy to overlook, yet they carried enormous meaning. The land had not given up, neither had the people. Then, little by little, the rain returned, not all at once. A gentle shower here, another several weeks later. Each rainfall was greeted almost like a celebration. Children rushed outside to feel cool drops on their faces. Farmers stood silently beneath gray skies, allowing the rain to soak their hats and jackets. No one hurried indoors. For a few precious moments, they simply listened. The sound of rain falling onto thirsty earth became one of the most beautiful sounds they had ever heard. The drought did not end overnight. Dust storms still appeared from time to time, but they became less frequent, less powerful. The Great Plains slowly began breathing again. Hope, once carried only in memories, was beginning to return to the fields themselves. The hardest years were finally passing, yet the lessons of the Dust Bowl would remain long after the winds had faded. Lessons about nature, about patience, and about the quiet strength of ordinary people. The years passed slowly. The strongest dust storms became less frequent. The skies, once darkened by walls of drifting earth, gradually returned to their familiar shades of blue. Across the Great Plains, life did not return exactly as it had been before. Instead, it began again, in a quieter way. The families who had remained on their farms carried memories that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They remembered mornings when the sun disappeared behind dust. They remembered sweeping the floors again and again, only to find another thin layer of soil waiting by evening. They remembered the long nights when the wind never seemed to stop. But they also remembered something else. The kindness of neighbors, the strength of their families, and the simple determination to greet each new sunrise, no matter how difficult the day before had been. Across the country, the lessons of the Dust Bowl were not forgotten. Farmers began treating the land with greater care. New generations learned that healthy soil was more than dirt beneath their feet. It was a living foundation that needed protection. Schools taught children about crop rotation, contour plowing, and the importance of preserving native grasses. These ideas, once unfamiliar, became part of everyday farming across much of America. The long rows of shelter belt trees continued growing year after year. Their branches sheltered birds, their roots held the soil in place. Quietly, without asking for recognition, they became guardians of the prairie. Many of those trees still stand today. If you were to drive across parts of Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, or Nebraska, you would still see lines of mature trees stretching across open fields. They tell a silent story, a story of lessons learned through hardship. The people who had left for California built new lives as well. Some found steady work. Others faced new struggles before finally finding stability. Their children and grandchildren carried those stories into future generations. Family photographs from the Dust Bowl years remain carefully preserved in albums and museums. Black and white images show weathered faces, worn hats, dusty roads, and determined eyes. They remind us that history is not only made by presidents or famous leaders. Sometimes, history is written by ordinary families who quietly refuse to give up. Today, scientists continue studying the Dust Bowl, not because they wish to relive it, but because they hope to prevent similar disasters in the future. Climate, soil, water, wind, each remains part of a delicate balance. The story of the Dust Bowl reminds us that nature is incredibly generous, yet it also asks for respect. When we care for the land often cares for us in return. As evening settles once more across the Great Plains, the wind still moves gently through fields of wheat. Modern tractors now replace horses. Paved roads cross landscapes that once disappeared beneath towering walls of dust. Children still watch sunsets from farmhouse porches. Families still gather around dinner tables after long days of work. The prairie remains, changed but enduring, and if you stand quietly beneath a wide western sky, listening only to the breeze moving through the grass, you may almost imagine those earlier generations. The farmers who rose before dawn, the mothers who kept warm meals on the table despite impossible conditions, the children who dreamed of rain. Their voices have long since faded into history, yet their courage remains, not in monuments, not in grand speeches, but in every healthy field where crops grow today, in every shelter belt tree that slows the wind, and in every lesson passed from one generation to the next. Now, our journey through the Dust Bowl comes gently to an end. The prairie grows quiet once more. The stars appear one by one above the open plains. The wind has softened, the din has settled, and somewhere in the peaceful darkness, a new season quietly begins. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey through history. May your evening be calm. May your dreams be peaceful. And may the quiet strength of those who endured the Dust Bowl remind us that even after the harshest storms, hope can return. Good night.